Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Miljan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
The key is a learning organization will only emerge by the individuals starting to learn. It's not, an organization is not a thing. It's the individuals who make that thing, really. And so it starts with individuals learning.
Who is Jutta Eckstein?
Oh my God, where should I start here? It goes way back. Well, really uncertain where to start. So I started off actually as a teacher. So I have an education as being a teacher, but I never really, I completed everything, but I never really worked in that. However, I benefit from this a lot because teaching training is also part of what I'm doing. So I'm quite happy about that. And then I'm an engineer. And as an engineer, I kind of lost my heart in programming. So I then started off as a software developer, which I really loved. I think my first real language was actually C++. And then I encountered Smalltalk, which really became my love. And you can tell by that, that's quite some time ago. And then there was a time in a project I was working on where the project manager said, well, I don't know, but something has changed for the better since you are here on the team. And this made me think that maybe I can also offer something else than developing. It's not that I was fed up, but that just, it opened a door also. It showed just some possibilities. And then I first went into more like design and then more architecture, and then only more into, well, what is needed to ensure that teams pull together and not apart from each other. And all of that actually happened, which is kind of my encounter with Agile, with me being active mainly in two communities. So the one was the Smalltalk community and the other one was Patterns. And in both of those, Agile kind of originated in, I don't know, not everyone who is listening might know that, but it's really kind of two of the main roots of Agile are like Smalltalk and design patterns. So like I don't know, let's say kind of the first really important Agile approaches like extreme programming and Scrum, they have both discovered in Smalltalk projects, and also they have been published at first as designed as pattern languages actually before it has been published in other ways. So, and that's why it was kind of a natural. So then that's, now we're speaking at the moment, like back in 97, I learned about XP. So again, you can see how old I am. I'm sorry.
No, it's very important. I want to come back to this stuff, but it's very important, I think, to acknowledge that, and not many people know that. So
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and maybe I try to make the rest a little bit faster. So then I discovered that Agile stuff, and I used to work at the time also more in large projects. And so actually by the end of 2001, I was in a large project and just thought, well, which was a failure. And therefore they kind of restarted, and I got in, and it's not, I don't want to say like, it's, of course I saved it. There were more people and more changes that were happening at that time, right? But one of the changes I brought in was, well, let's do that Agile stuff. And because the pain was so high, people were really open for everything. And for me, this was also cool because, well, again, it was by the end of 2001, beginning 2002, well, whole 2002, definitely. Nobody spoke about scaling Agile, right? So we just learned about the manifesto that has been created. Well, Scrum and XP were around a bit, Scrum not known so much at the time. So this was kind of exciting, and it all worked out. And this was then, well, and then there were other projects following. However, that was then the trigger for me to write my first book, actually. So which was on scaling Agile. And published it in 2004. And of course, nobody was interested because people had other problems.
Well, that's the case, I think, with a lot of your books. And I wanted to come back to that too, is like that they're a little bit ahead of their time and a little bit, not necessarily what people are currently looking for, but what they will be looking for in the near future.
That's true. That's true. Well, my hope was with the Bossa Nova book, which I think, the first publication was in 2018, that this was much more timely than my other books. I absolutely agree, because the second book on distributed Agile that was published in 2010, and at that time people started looking into scaling, but not into global stuff, right? What do we do? How do we organize distributed and dispersed teams and all of that? So,
So maybe, so maybe let's what is, so it's interesting from a perspective that, Agile, it was born, but really like the practitioners that started this movement, I think understood complexity. So they just probably understood people and complexity. That's why even if we go to Agile Manifesto, I think I've described it and others, it's a value system more than it is practices and frameworks, right?
Yeah, I thought more like value system and maybe guidelines also.
When you look at and when you reflect back, what is important today to you? From a perspective of Agile, from a perspective where it is, what do you consider important? What motivates you currently around the work that we do?
Okay, so these are for me two different questions. The one is, what do you think about reflecting back? Which sounds to me more looking at, okay, what kind of change did it really bring or so? And the other thing is, what motivates me today, or what do I think? Where is it now? So which one is more important? Which one do you want to go first?
It's almost like what I wanted you to do is almost like retrospect, right? Like if you look at back in a context of what has happened over the last 20 years, right? And then if you kind of look at the next 5 to 10 years, what do you want to focus on? What's important to you based on the experience, I guess. So it's more forward looking, but don't forget where we come from.
I think I really have actually a clear answer. So for me, the Agile Manifesto is and has always been super important. Well, I started off with XP, but still, once the manifesto was out, it was really more the manifesto that guided what I've done, which was also the reason because a lot of the stuff that I did, there wasn't really anything out there. And so there was no scaling something or distributed Agiles, whatever. And so what I always did was I looked at the manifesto, at the values and at the principles, and thought, okay, what do they mean in the context I'm in right now? Like in this large context, or something we haven't talked about yet is like, I remember the first hardware project I did. So, well, the manifesto was created for software. So what do I do now? And so I kept coming back to the manifesto, and it's kind of wearing different glasses, looking at the principles through those glasses. So like the hardware, large, global, whatever, and thought, okay, can they provide some guidance there? And I still felt they could. And starting with the distributed one, if you think of this one principle that says like the face-to-face conversation is the best way to convey information, right? That people often said, at least way back when, that, well, that's a reason why you cannot do Agile in a global setting, right? In a distributed
Exactly.
setting. And for me, it was more, well, we still want to aim for that. So let's look how we can aim for that. And of course, we cannot do this like all the time. We don't have a common war room, of course not. But what can we do to still see this as our guidelines and seeing that this is really important for us to build the trust and to connect and to ship really also,
And to
right?
communicate. I think a lot of times it's becoming even more now, like, and I think that specific principle of, face to face is like people don't fully understand that it was never about face to face. It was always about communication, collaboration,
Direct
trust,
connections.
right?
Yeah, trust.
Have relationships. But the most effective and the richest way to communicate, especially when it was written back in 2001, was face to face.
Yes.
So I think, going, and this goes back to the patterns, right? You have to understand the why behind the pattern and
Yes.
be able to depict the pattern rather than just assume the practice or principle for what it is.
That's true. Yeah. So we haven't answered yet the forward looking. So, and the thing is really, I keep coming back to that, and that's what I do right now. So what's my big passion is at the moment is sustainability in the sense of like social, economic, and environmental. So also fighting the climate change. And I think, well, even here, the manifesto can provide some guidance. And I know, well, more and more people start talking about that. So my take is not so much on saying, okay, well, I think I have to say it this way. Agile is the hammer and therefore also sustainability is a nail. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, well, there are forecasts that say by 2030, IT will consume about 21% of the overall energy consumption, which means it's not that software, IT, whatever, is a resolution, as a lot of people think, to the climate change. Well, it can be, it really can be and is in some areas, but it also has a bad impact. And so actually, it's more like coming back to the thing that we do with Agile, which is developing software, delivering it, making the customer happy and all of that. But now looking at the principles, what does this actually mean if we take sustainability serious? So what is the carbon footprint of the software that we are writing? How ethical is the software that we are creating? And well, there's a lot of discussion about like algorithm bias and stuff like that, which plays into this. And even in, well, once we are back in the offices, even in the offices, like, is the carpet glued with a toxic glue to the floor, right? And do we have natural light there, natural plant? This all plays into the same thing. And just saying this about like the carpet and stuff. So this is what I see in that principle where it says, like, trust motivated individuals and give them the environment to get their job done. So looking at environment, all of a sudden it has a different meaning. And this is, again, what I mean with, I keep coming back to the principles and look at them. What do they mean through this glasses that I'm wearing right now, right?
So what you're saying, and like, I want to use that, I like that metaphor of glasses and back to the values and value systems, is that, when we look into different glasses, we're also looking through different set of values and principles and beliefs, right? So that requires us to believe what we're seeing through those glasses and buy into what we're seeing through those glasses, right? So when we talk about like sustainability, when we talk about exactly what you just described, I can't just say, like, I have to believe that putting that toxic glue on the carpet is something that is wrong and I'm not going to tolerate, right? It's not just saying, oh yeah, but screw it, it's making my company more, saving my
Yeah.
company more money.
Yeah, right. Which is kind of the same as what we say in Agile in general. And I'm not sure. I guess more people have heard discussions about that, even things like, well, creating all those tests, that takes time away from shipping to the client or whatever. And well, we just say like, there are the values. These are important for us. And that's why we have those principles guiding those values.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's just it's individual decision to embrace those principles and values, I guess. And
That's true. Yeah. And to me, this was just always a really big help. So, and yeah, I think it can just be a great guidance if you think Agile is for you important because you want to be or have to be flexible, adaptive, responsive, fast, nimble, whatever else, right? So really Agile more in the literal sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do you need to do to behave like that, or to show that, or become that? And this is what I think the principles do, at least that's what they offer to me. And it might be perhaps even boring for other people because, well, it's not the Bible. And no, it's not, but it gives some great ideas and it can really trigger deep thoughts, again, wearing different classes.
Yeah, and like we've gone, maybe just to kind of summarize this, but and to kind of come back to what's coming, or maybe what in addition to what you describe about sustainability. But last 20 years, if Agile Manifesto and from small talk to pattern language to pattern communities that you discussed, all of that was at least that community understood the importance of patterns complexity, right? And a lot of what we've seen over the last 10, 20 years is shift towards more of processes and practices back to what those people were running away from. Because if you see all the frameworks now, all the focus on practices, do you see that as well? And do you see the shift back to understanding, or is it more balanced approach?
Yeah. So yes and no. And the no comes more from it that I think this has always been the case.
So pendulum always swinging.
That's one of the things, but also people always have asked for recipes. And the frameworks are giving you that. They give you a recipe and therefore you feel much safer than without one. So you just follow that, and then it's the recipe's fault if it's not working out.
Yeah.
And that is easier than saying, well, you actually have to think for yourself. What is appropriate? What would help you here? Which also then, especially in cultures where you think like, okay, who's accountable, right? And then the ones who are not following some predefined path, they have a problem then, right? If it's not working out. And the reason probably is more that it seems to be difficult to really embrace this kind of experimental approach, or what we call with Bossa Nova, the probing thing, where you always reflect, what is it, where are we at, what's difficult right now, what's our hypothesis that's actually happening and will happen if we do this and that change, and then thinking of the change you do, thinking about how you measure it also in order to be able to tell, well, that hypothesis was true or not, and then start reflecting again. But it's actually, the probing is actually more a scientific approach to running experiments. It's nothing.
And dealing with, and it's like dealing with complexity. Like what I really liked about Bossa Nova is like, it's collection. So you have like with beyond budgeting, with open space, with sociocracy, with Agile. These are all combination of patterns to deal with complexity, right?
Right.
And it's just still collection of patterns. I how would you describe the patterns in the context of that recipe and cooking analogy? Is it almost like, oh, here's a barbecue sauce, if you need barbecue sauce, here's how but you're still putting things together based on your
Yeah.
context. Like
Yeah.
how do you define patterns in that context?
Well, I'm not sure if I have a good answer. The thing that we discovered when we worked on Bossa Nova, so John Bach and myself, we found that although most of those people of those different patterns or streams, how we often call them as well, that most of them said, actually, we have the answer. And from their perspective, that is true. It's again a kind of a recipe. So if I talk to people who are really deep into sociocracy, they were saying, well, you don't need anything else because you are just ensuring that the power is distributed and not centralized, that the equivalence is there, all voices get heard, and then it will all resolve itself. And it is kind of true, in the same way as it is true that you could also say from an Agile perspective, well, all you need is a retrospective, and you keep retrospecting and changing and do it better, and which is also true in a sense. Yeah. And in the same way as beyond budgeting, they say, well, we all know money rules the world, and as long as we use money to control all the work, there's no way of being more agile. So the budget has to really deal with that complexity and address it, and otherwise you will not getting anywhere. And again, so they are all true from their perspective.
So let me ask you this then, is the idea, I get it. So I want to get your answer on this. So do you see Bossa Nova as more integrative, holistic, like where it considers multiple truths, or is that the idea behind Bossa Nova?
So I would say so. So it is this holistic view. It's a synthesis without being a closed synthesis. So if you think about I have the book back there, right? If you think about the kind of the logo that we are using, the thing is where I have mirror, there's the Nova, which has an arrow going further. Exactly. And what we meant with that is, although we see all those four streams are really providing each a different view on a company, they are also not the sole truth. So the Bossa is not the sole truth. We need also the Nova, because we know new stuff will be developed and new stuff is also out there. Use it and apply it, but always kind of, don't forget to have that holistic view on the organization.
But Nova also applied. I really like that. That's what resonated with me. And I think what Nova, in exactly what you indicated there, is symbolizing emergence and complexity, right? Yes. So it's that, like, hey, embrace the emergence and what's coming through these, patterns or whatever you're seeing. So that's really, and that's why I said, like, a lot of this stuff, it's beyond its time, because I think this is probably for the last 5 years that people have started, and I don't think a lot of this stuff will be understood or mainstream in the next 10 years. At least that's my looking at things, because
that could well be true. So maybe kind of, I don't know if it's really a closure, but to add to this point, so when we created that holistic view and that synthesis, we really struggled to move on, because we knew the reader will sit there and say, John, Jutta, tell me now what? So what is it that I can do now? I understand that this is a holistic thing, and I have to have a different perspective on things and change the perspective and look for the patterns and all of that. But now tell me what to do, because it was obvious for us that people still will ask for a recipe.
Well, that's
And
and coming back to that, maybe just to explore this, because I've written on this and talked about it, but like it's an issue where ingredients in organizations keep changing daily or all the time, right?
that's true.
And you always have to, that Emergence Nova is coming up with a recipe that currently works for you in your context, right? And if we rely on Jutta and Milan to come in and say like, hey, here's your recipe, right? Then you're really not embracing developing your own chefs and getting people to figure things out on their own. Because and maybe just to come to a different question then, is that why company-wide agility is so hard? I mean, why do you think, what are some of the things that you're seeing where, and from your perspective, you worked on big projects, what are some of the things that you see when it comes to company-wide agility and why companies struggle?
So the one thing first is that I think with the probing, we found a kind of a bridge to a recipe. And with all the example probes that we are having here, and we still collect them, also having them on our website. So it gives examples. And this, I think, makes it easier also for company-wide agility to kind of learn through examples. And what we see is that people are asking for that, but then they look at an example probe and say, well, but actually my situation is different, so I need something else. And we said, yes, exactly, you need something else. And that's perfect. So this is not to your question. So this is more like, okay, it is still a kind of a recipe by those example probes, and the idea of probing, reflecting, and coming up with a hypothesis and then an experiment. Yet still, it is also difficult. And I believe the main reason is that you need this holistic perspective to really think of company-wide agility. And most often, people just think of one area. And even in so what I've seen, maybe this is a good example, although it's bad. So a company, I was only there like for a day or something. So very short, they just want to hear like, what do I think about this also? And they were using Scrum for quite some time in their IT department. And pretty well. So it's not that you could say, well, this was whatever, dark Scrum or however you want to call it, Scrum Butt or anything. So this was all fine. And the company decided to really go more agile, more towards company-wide agility, and which meant to have what I call real cross-functional teams. So not only that we say testers together with developers and backend with front end and stuff like that, but real cross-functional across the silos of the company, meaning the business, the sales, marketing, whoever is mid part of that team. Guess who had the biggest problems with that? The Scrum teams. They said, well, we really want to have that product owner who tells us, and we don't want to, now maybe this goes more into Agile fluency, we don't want to be in that position that we explore new markets together as a team, right? We want to have somebody who tells us. And I thought this is quite interesting. It's there it was more the other side, not IT side. They were more ready for that.
Well, exactly. And I think I see that as, I see same thing. And I think there's twofold.
I believe so.
There's the people side, the value system that's going on, or the lenses that people are looking through, right? So if I'm not open to do that, the other thing is, I think the limitations of Scrum. I don't see Scrum as a true high complexity framework, right?
Yeah.
So when we have a lot of high levels of complexity, I don't think Scrum is a good recipe for it. And a lot of times that backfires on people. So do you see it that way? Or, I mean, like, what do you think about those two, between the people and operating systems that are running in our heads, or the things that we're seeing through our lenses?
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And it's also, I guess, that when now I'm staying with this example, when this request was made to go towards real cross-functional teams, the Scrum teams, they felt like, oh, but this is not how Scrum is described. And they're right. That's true, right? And from that perspective, again, referring maybe more to Agile fluency, if you are like using Scrum, then you are kind of at the beginning zone of going into Agile, but only if you really go into company-wide agility, then Scrum doesn't help you that much anymore.
It's the patterns, right? It's understanding what's underneath, what's good about Scrum, what's your context, and then contextualizing. But it's tough for organizations to do that. But yet we see a lot of scaling frameworks. And I'm not picking, a lot of people pick on SAFe. I think, there are context and there's, less that, all of these different frameworks they have a lot of good patterns. But if your context or your environment is not set up for that, it's tough.
Yeah, I think this is not the only thing. So the main thing is that people more or less try to implement it as they learned it, got educated in it, read about it. And it's exactly what you're saying. They are not contextualizing. And then those frameworks are not working anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's probably not necessarily the framework's fault, but on the other hand, they often also don't motivate too much to contextualize, because which I also understand, they also say, okay, here it is. This is what we offer. And if you just follow that, then it's all fine. Yet you still have to reflect and adapt.
Yeah. So, so just to stay on this topic of company-wide agility, I wanted to get your thoughts on importance and how do you get trust and alignment when you're scaling, right? Because those are two really important things if you want to scale up or scale down. Scaling doesn't necessarily mean, right, like just scaling up. You could be scaling down. So from your perspective, what is the relationship between trust and alignment?
Yeah, well, one of the key thing is that trust can only be given. And also what I think I learned this once from Tom DeMarco, who had shared a story where he was saying like, well, trust always has to go ahead, which is sometimes discussed in a different way, that people think, well, you have to earn the trust also is what people say. But actually, you can only show the trust if somebody trusts in you. Otherwise, you cannot, because then there will be always control, and therefore you just don't have the leeway to show that you are trustworthy. And so this is, I think, one of the difficulties. And there, again, from a Bossa Nova perspective or company-wide perspective, I would say all of those 4 streams are really paying into that. Starting with sociocracy, saying, well, we really ensure every voice is getting heard, and also how we make decisions, that we really want to ensure everyone is with us here without being completely slowed down, like with a consensus decision, right? So that helps already, because it shows the trust. I show the trust. I know you can be part of that decision, and we believe in you there. And definitely same with open space. So open space as a strategy, meaning, well, we trust you that you understand what are the next features or the next product we should work on, or but kind of, even if you start small, like with self-selecting teams, we trust you that you select the teams in a way, or come up with a team emergent structure in a way so that we can be successful. It's not somebody else deciding. We trust you all, right?
But
And
that takes a different type of leader to actually
yes,
let go of that, right?
well, being courageous,
Ah,
probably. Hmm. Yeah, well, and beyond budgeting, same thing. It's often you control most of what's going on in a company through the numbers, but here you say, well, we trust you. And I have a great example that was way before I knew about beyond budgeting of I think it's kind of the second biggest software company, at least way back when in Germany. So
mhm.
not comparable to like IBM or whatever, but still. And I was there, that's maybe 15 years ago or so. So it's really long ago. And so my client took me to the canteen for lunch, and I was completely surprised to see what was going on there. So people kind of went up and looked for the lunch, which they then got handed over from the kitchen staff. And then there was an open cashier where people put in their money and collected their exchange. There was nobody sitting there, no camera watching
Uh-huh.
it. It was completely trusting everyone who's working in that company that they will just pay what's requested and being trustworthy on that.
Yeah.
And that really was sticking with me. And I said, well, what a strong signal to the people. And on the other hand, you could also say, well, people in companies, we all trust the people to run those $1 million projects, but we don't trust them to pay for their lunch. What
Yeah.
is this?
Well, it goes
Yeah.
back also to what you just said. What was it like? Trust is leading, or trusting is always
Yes, it always
ahead,
goes
right?
ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
it's like you get to show trust, especially
Yeah.
from a company perspective.
Yes. Yes.
Um, that goes into, and I know this is also close to you, architecture and design and policies. So when we talk about company-wide agility, what are some of the things when it comes to design and architecture and policies that we need to also look through a different set of eyeglasses?
So now probably we are also shifting more towards alignment, what I haven't really talked
Mm-hmm.
about much. And there
Exactly.
for me, it is really, I would say, more provided by the structure you are setting up with. And again, I think like sociocracy is just offering a great deal here, so that you elect those people who you as a team, for example, trust that they make the right decisions
Mm-hmm.
on your architecture. If you need something like an enterprise-wide or company-wide, which is not always required, which is also a thing that definitely needs to be questioned, because sometimes these things are ruled, although they are not really necessary, and they are more in the way than being helpful. But there are also good reasons why you really want to have that and you need it. And if you have like product line development or something like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is really for me more, how do we structure ourselves? How do we organize ourselves so that we have this structure where we know there are people who can make that decision together, and it's not a decision made on the ivory tower, but more like a
Mm-hmm.
bottom-up election of representatives coming together and making those decisions.
Yeah, and like when it really, what I wanted to, again, coming back to the alignment, coming back to the complexity, and where we started here, we talk about emerging architecture and software development,
Yes.
but we don't really have emerging architecture and organizational design, right? Or
Yes. Yes.
do you think we're gonna get there? Because most of the companies are so used to kind of what we've seen with IT systems, like big, don't change it. There's um, and sociocracy is just one of the. I like really S3, and S3 specifies it's similar to I'm referring to sociocracy 3.0, and like there are different patterns for scaling or different patterns for architecture and structure, and th- this is in my opinion something that's ahead of its time. But do you maybe see it differently from a perspective? What's coming or what's going to work in complexity when it comes to alignment, design, architecture, or how
Yeah,
design
well,
and architecture can help alignment, I guess.
yes, it can. I I really assume that we will have more network structures, and the network
Mhm,
structures in a way that they help us in a sense to scale down and not up.
mhm, mhm,
So a bit of what we hear from some companies like WL Gore, that they say, well, not bigger than 120 people, and then we start a new branch and where we organize ourselves, and so then the different branches are connected, which is one way of having such a more a network structure. So it's more autonomous areas maybe, and then
mhm.
those autonomous areas being connected then again.
Exactly. And I was talking to Dave Snowden maybe a couple of months ago on my podcast, and he was saying like why this is important. I really liked how he described it in the sense, if you want innovation, if you're dealing in complexity, you got to have emergence, right? So the best way to have an emergence is to decentralize and
Mm-hmm.
let those
Mm-hmm.
agents, whatever you want to call it, self-organize. And
Yes.
again, this goes back to alignment and trust. If we don't if we don't trust our people and help them or help structure alignment, then we're back to what we were, which is not a very good way to deal with the
Mm-hmm.
with increasing complexity, right?
Well, actually, you can also think this way about like a big open space.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking of companies really like big open spaces, you have that common theme, what is the company's purpose? What is the thing that holds us together? What do we want? What kind of difference do we want to make in the world? And
Mm-hmm.
and then you have people who want to work on different areas that contribute or pay into that purpose, and they come together, make that happen. And once they're done, they look for other stuff they want to work on. So, which is open space is an emergent structure,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly.
Which has that alignment with that theme. And I can imagine that something like this is really more happening in the future just because it's needed. And I also know, well, the bigger the companies are getting, the more they feel like, oh, we have to have this carved in stone almost.
Mm-hmm.
And there are sometimes also people asking for that kind of, okay, where's my role description or something? Well, maybe you define it, and maybe you define it today different than you would do tomorrow. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, which comes with a lot of uncertainty again. So we are back to, sometimes it feels just safer to have that kind of recipe.
Exactly, and it goes back also to, I guess, the other point about some of us are more comfortable with uncertainty, some of us aren't, and there's no one size fits all, right?
Yes.
And then also cultures. I mean, like I grew up in Bosnia and Sarajevo, and that whole Balkans area, as you probably know, is the environment there is a lot different than it is here in the United States. So your environment shapes
That's true.
what you see through your glasses. So I think having that context is really important as we become more in global society and we
Mhm.
start collaborating and having themes of why certain people see things different way, and
Mm.
understanding that. um, so you
Which
said
is a different topic and interesting one
yeah.
by itself. Like
Oh yeah,
talking
so that's
about
why I said,
agile.
like, most of this is like, just trying to, like, if we're sitting in the coffee shop and just talking, we could deep dive into a lot of these, and
That's true.
they're topic by themselves, but it's interesting to hear your perspective on some of this stuff. And what's even more interesting to me is, as I'm talking to each of my guests, there are patterns emerging in a sense of what people are saying, and
Mm.
it's really helping me
Hmm.
understand, like, here are different people with different backgrounds and perspectives, but in a nutshell, they're saying the same thing. And I don't know how much it has to do with other biases or, what we would condition, but it is interesting. Having a background in teaching and learning, what do you think? How can companies become learning organizations? I know you've talked about this in the past, but what have you learned, and what would you like to share around becoming a learning organization?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a thing we have talked already about, which is having this approach to probes or to experiments, being open and courageous to do that, because that's the only way you will be innovative. Actually, trying things out, but in a maybe even a controlled way, by having that hypothesis first, so you know what you're actually trying and what you can learn from it, right? And I sometimes, I struggle, and you might have seen me struggling with that before, with the thing that we say in Agile very often, that it's so important to fail fast, where I just think this is so wrong. It's such a wrong message, because the goal is not to fail fast. The goal is to learn fast. And you do what you need to do in order to learn fast. And sometimes it implies failure, and sometimes it implies not failure, or whatever it does. Yeah. But the failure is not your goal. It's a means, and that's
exactly.
I struggle with that always. However, having said that, it means for a learning organization, it must be, well, more than okay, it must be understood that in order to learn, we have to run experiments and look at them, what they teach us back. And then with what they taught us back, we do the next step. We're on the next experiment and try to learn from that.
So empiricism in a nutshell, in a sense, learn through experience, right? I really like, to stay a little bit on the probing piece, because you described it as a aha moment, and also something that you think is necessary in order to deal with the current environment. So how, like, this probing is all about experience. It's all about learning, what you just described, and it gives, unlike recipe, I think probing, I wouldn't call it a recipe. I think it's more, it gives people permission and encourages them to create experiences. Because you're not saying like, here's a recipe, you're saying like, here's an idea. If you want to make barbecue sauce, here's an idea of how you make barbecue sauce, but don't assume that, what you do here is going to work. Like, here's just an idea so you can get started. Is that how you see probing, in the sense of more of like encouraging experience?
So what you described was, I would more refer to, that's a probe. Now, probing for me is the whole approach, and the whole approach is, well, and that is a kind of a recipe, really. Start with reflecting on your situation, then come up with a hypothesis that you have based on that reflection. Then with that hypothesis, develop an experiment that can validate or invalidate your hypothesis. And when you run the experiment, measure before and after, so you know what you really learn. And then the kind of last or additional step, which I think is really also super important, is please talk about it, publish about it. And that goes back to what you said earlier. So we don't know much about emergent organizational architectures. Well, we don't, because not much is talked about that. It's not much talked about what have people tried and how did it work out, in which context, and maybe my context is similar and therefore I might try that, or maybe I change it completely or whatever. So it's that, learning from your peers, and your peers can be the globe.
Well, is it the peers, but it's also, I'm assuming, the customer, because there's customer is at the center there as well. So how do we get closer to the customer too, right? Because
right.
So maybe, I don't know, as a last question is, or just a statement, like what would you share? Like, I really love your forward looking, and that motivates me in a sense of like just seeing like other people that kind of have expressed what's in my head better than what I've been able to, and see things what's coming. So what would be your message to somebody that's learning about agile, or wants to learn more about these patterns driven? um, what message would you give to those, not necessarily that are familiar with the patterns, but the ones that
Yeah.
are not, which is the vast majority of people?
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that I iterated around that already. Yet, so the key thing for me is probably really taking time for reflection. And too often we feel, or we are pushed to go into action,
Mhm.
and just going into action is the same way as delivering stuff. So, which is delivering output, but not outcome, right?
Mhm.
And therefore not making much difference. So action doesn't really help us. So take time to reflect, and then go into action based on your reflection. So again, that's why I'm saying I kind of iterated about that already, which is again the probing thing. Or if you stay in the action perspective, just think of using retrospectives in various ways. So with your team, but also maybe on different organizational levels, so that you can also reflect on what's helping you in the structure that you're having in that organization. Or maybe also it's an individual kind of retrospective. Where are you with your ideas and stuff, and where do you want to go next? So yeah, I think the intentional stillness
Mhm.
is what's too often missing.
Great.
Saying me, and this is me saying that, who is talking all the time most times.
No, but I think that's something that we need to come back. I mean, like the whole, I think, reflection, contemplation, like a lot of like, in a sense, it's what you're saying is working on ourselves. Like, we talk
Yes.
about understanding organizations, understanding, but we really don't know much about ourselves. It goes back to emotional intelligence, goes back to self-awareness. It goes back to a lot of these things that we're very reactive. And I think what you're saying, and what I understood, is more like, take a time. I used to play soccer, and my dad would always tell me, my coach is, you gotta, stop and lift your head up and look
Yeah.
at the field,
Right.
understand the field.
Right.
You can't just be, dribbling and looking down.
Yes.
So it's
Exactly.
kind of like that.
Yeah. And actually, this reminds me of what we talked about earlier, which was maybe a bit short, how we talked about it, the learning organization, which connects really to that, because the key is a learning organization will only emerge by the individuals starting to learn. It's not, an organization is not a thing. It's the individuals who make that thing, really. And so it starts with individuals learning.